Have you ever been physically exhausted, yet mentally unable to stop? Your body is asking for sleep, your eyes are heavy, the room is quiet. And yet, your mind suddenly reopens a conversation from 6 hours ago. You replay what was said, then what you should have said, then what the other person might have meant, then what might happen the next time you see them. Before you realize it, your brain has already constructed entire emotional scenarios for events that may never happen. And perhaps the most frustrating part is this. You know it isn't helping. You know the thoughts are repetitive. You know you should let it go, but the thinking continues anyway. If this feels familiar, you have probably heard the usual advice. Just relax. Stop overthinking. You're being too sensitive. At first, those explanations sound reasonable, but they assume overthinking is simply a failure of self-control, a bad habit, a personality flaw, something you should be able to switch off through discipline alone. But psychology suggests something more complex may be happening. What overthinking is not really about weak self-control? What if it is the natural result of a nervous system that learned to stay highly alert? A mind trained to scan for patterns, to anticipate outcomes, to search for hidden meaning before danger has the chance to arrive. Because some minds do not simply react to life, they simulate it constantly. And while that ability can create insight, empathy, and sharp awareness, it can also become exhausting when the system never learns when it is safe to stop. In this video, we're going to explore 7 hidden psychological mechanisms behind chronic overthinking. Not surface-level advice, not simplistic motivation, but the deeper emotional and neurological patterns that may explain why your mind behaves this way. Because overthinking is often treated like a personal weakness, but in many cases, it is a protective strategy that outlived the environment that created it. And by the end of this video, you may begin to realize something important. Your overthinking were never random. The first thing many people misunderstand about overthinking is that they assume it reflects weakness, that if you replay conversations, anticipate problems, or mentally rehearse outcomes, it must mean you are anxious, emotionally unstable, or somehow unable to cope with uncertainty like everyone else. But psychology suggests a different possibility. In many cases, overthinking is not the absence of intelligence. It is intelligence operating without a clear stopping point, because what often looks like emotional chaos from the outside may actually be a form of heightened pattern detection. Some minds are naturally built to search for connections, to notice inconsistencies, to identify subtle risks before they fully emerge. This process is closely tied to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, reasoning, decision-making, and anticipation. For some individuals, this system becomes exceptionally active, which means the brain does not simply process what is happening in the present moment. It immediately begins predicting what could happen next, and then what could happen after that. A simple interaction becomes a branching possibility tree. A delayed text message becomes multiple interpretations. A difficult conversation becomes a chain of imagined consequences. An uncertain decision becomes a full internal simulation of potential outcomes. This is what psychologists sometimes describe as predictive cognition. The brain continuously generates models of the future in an attempt to reduce uncertainty. And when combined with strong risk anticipation, this system can become exhausting. Because the mind is not reacting only to reality. It is reacting to possibilities, some accurate, some imagined. Some are emotionally exaggerated by stress. This is why telling an overthinker to just stop thinking often misses the point entirely. The brain is not malfunctioning in the simple sense. It is doing exactly what it has become highly skilled at doing. Scanning, modeling, predicting. Your brain isn't broken. It's a radar with no shutdown command. And like any radar, it was likely built for a reason. Because minds do not usually become hypervigilant without some form of reinforcement, which raises a deeper question. If intelligent overthinking is a protective system, where did that system learn to become so alert in the first place? But intelligent minds don't become this way by accident. This is where the conversation becomes more personal, because intelligent overthinking rarely begins in isolation. For many people, it starts as an adaptation. The nervous system learns, very early, that unpredictability can be dangerous. Psychology uses the term hypervigilance to describe a state of heightened alertness, when the brain becomes unusually focused on detecting possible threats, emotional shifts, or subtle warning signs in the environment. And for a child, this can be an incredibly logical response. Imagine growing up around unpredictable parents, Not necessarily abusive in obvious ways, but emotionally inconsistent, warm one day, distant the next, calm in one moment, suddenly critical of another. Or perhaps you lived in an environment where mistakes felt emotionally expensive, a wrong answer, a disappointing grade, a poorly timed comment, and the emotional consequences felt bigger than they should have. Children are remarkably adaptive. When the environment feels unstable, the brain begins searching for patterns. How do I avoid conflict? How do I predict mood changes? How do I stay one step ahead? Without realizing it, the child learns a survival equation. Anticipate, survive. Notice more, stay safe. Think ahead, reduce pain, and over time this becomes automatic. What began as protection slowly becomes personality. What began as vigilance becomes overthinking. Seen through this lens, the behavior looks very different. Not dysfunction, not weakness, but survival intelligence. A highly sensitive cognitive system doing exactly what it once needed to do. The painful part is that the environment may change, but the nervous system often does not. The adult may now live in relative safety, but the mind still behaves as though emotional danger could appear at any moment. Still scanning, still rehearsing, still preparing. Your overthinking may be old protection wearing modern clothes. And for many people, simply understanding that changes something important. Because shame begins to soften when behavior starts making psychological sense. But there is another distinction we need to make. Because not every form of intense thinking is harmful. Some forms create insight, growth, self-awareness. Others trap you in emotional loops that lead nowhere. And learning the difference may be one of the most important shifts of all. But not all thinking is equally harmful. This is an important distinction, because not all intense thinking deserves the same label. From the outside, reflection and rumination can look almost identical. In both cases, you appear quiet, internally focused, replaying events, turning experiences over in your mind. But psychologically, they are very different processes. Reflective thinking is often healthy. It helps you understand your emotional reactions, recognize patterns in your behavior from difficult experiences, adjust how you respond next time. Imagine arguing with someone you care about. Later that evening, you revisit the conversation and ask yourself, why did that affect me so strongly? Was I reacting only to the moment or to something older? What could I communicate more clearly next time? This kind of thinking creates insight. It moves somewhere. Even if the answers are uncomfortable, the process is active and constructive. It helps transform emotional confusion into understanding. But brooding rumination feels very different. The same argument replays again and again. But now the questions change. Why did I say that? Why am I always like this? What if they secretly resent me? What if I ruined everything? Instead of creating clarity, the mind becomes trapped in repetition, not searching for solutions, only circling pain. This is where self-punishment often enters. The emotional tone shifts from curiosity to criticism, from learning to looping, from reflection to paralysis. One is processing, the other, a psychological quicksand. And this distinction matters because many overthinkers believe all thinking is productive, simply because the mind feels busy. But mental activity is not the same as emotional progress. A treadmill creates motion. It does not necessarily create movement. Brooding rumination can feel strangely convincing because it creates the illusion that you are working on the problem, that if you think hard enough, one more replay will somehow create relief. But often, it only deepens exhaustion, sleeplessness, self-doubt, emotional fatigue. And perhaps the most difficult part is how subtle the transition can be. Healthy reflection does not announce when it becomes harmful. There is rarely a clear line. A useful moment of self-awareness can quietly slip into hours of emotional self-interrogation without you even noticing. Which is why many people stay trapped much longer than they realize. Because the dangerous part is not simply overthinking itself. The dangerous part is how easily one becomes the other. If overthinking is so exhausting, an obvious question follows. Why does the brain keep doing something that makes us feel worse? The answer is surprisingly uncomfortable. Because subtly, the brain may be rewarding the behavior. Part of this involves dopamine, the neurotransmitter often associated with reward, motivation, and anticipation. Most people think dopamine appears only when something pleasurable happens. But psychologically, the brain can also release small reward signals during the pursuit of solving uncertainty, even imagined uncertainty. This means that every time you mentally replay an argument, build a future scenario, or rehearse a self-defense script for a conversation that may never happen, your brain experiences a tiny sense of engagement, a feeling that something useful is happening, that progress is being made, even when, objectively, nothing is changing. This creates a difficult loop. The mind learns something powerful. Thinking creates stimulation. Thinking creates a sense of preparation. Thinking creates the emotional illusion of safety. And once that association forms, overthinking becomes harder to interrupt, because the behavior no longer feels entirely negative. It feels strangely productive, even comforting. Imagine replaying a difficult interaction with someone. Part of you feels distressed, but another part believes that if you analyze it just a little longer, you may finally uncover the perfect explanation, the perfect response, the missing insight that will make the uncertainty disappear. So the mind continues, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it has learned to associate thinking with control, and control with safety. This is why some forms of overthinking feel compulsive rather than intentional. Your mind isn't just trapped, it's chemically incentivized to stay there. And this explains why simple advice often fails so badly. Just stop thinking assumes overthinking is purely a conscious choice. But habits reinforced by emotional reward rarely disappear through force alone, especially when the brain believes the habit is helping you survive uncertainty. In fact, trying to suppress the thoughts can sometimes make them louder, because resistance itself signals importance. The mind hears, this matters. Keep monitoring, keep solving, keep scanning. So what looks like a lack of discipline is often something far more complex. A learned feedback loop between uncertainty, reward, and temporary emotional relief. And once that loop becomes established, brute force willpower becomes a poor tool for breaking it. This is why willpower rarely works. At this point, many people try the most intuitive solution. They fight the thoughts directly. They tell themselves to stop, to calm down, to think about something else, to force mental silence through effort. And for a brief moment, it can seem possible, until the thoughts return even louder. This is one of the strangest and most frustrating parts of chronic overthinking. The harder you resist, the noisier the mind becomes. Psychology has long observed a version of this called the thought suppression paradox. The more forcefully you try not to think about something, the more mentally present it becomes. Because suppression requires monitoring. To avoid a thought, the brain must keep checking whether the thought is still there, which means attention remains locked onto the very thing you are trying to escape. Neuroscientifically, part of this makes sense. When overthinking intensifies, the default mode network, or DMN, often becomes highly active. This is the internal mental system associated with self-referential thinking, memory replay, future simulation, and internal narrative. At the same time, the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, may remain activated, signaling uncertainty or possible threat. And eventually, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational regulation and executive control, becomes overloaded. So now the system is trapped in a difficult loop. Internal chatter increases. Emotional alarm remains active. The part of the brain meant to restore order becomes fatigued. This creates the exact inner experience many overthinkers know intimately. The more you try to control the thoughts, the less controllable they feel. The more you demand certainty, the more uncertainty expands. The more urgently you seek quiet, the louder the noise becomes. Trying to force stop overthinking is like trying to smooth water by punching it. The effort itself creates more disturbance, which is why self-judgment often makes things worse. Because frustration adds another emotional layer to an already overloaded system. Now you are not only anxious, you are anxious about being anxious. Not only thinking, but thinking about the fact that you are thinking. And this is where many people become exhausted. Not because they lack mental strength, but because they are using the wrong strategy against the wrong mechanism. If overthinking is not solved through force, suppression, or brute discipline, then the real question becomes something much more important. So what actually works? If force does not work, the next question becomes, what does? One of the most helpful ideas from acceptance and commitment therapy, or AT, is surprisingly simple. The goal is not to eliminate the thought. It is to change your relationship with it. One of the hidden reasons overthinking becomes so painful is that we tend to merge with our thoughts completely. If the mind says, I'm going to fail, it feels like reality. If the mind says, they must be disappointed in me, it feels like the truth. If the mind says, something is wrong with me, it begins to sound like identity. But thoughts are not always facts, and they are certainly not always definitions of who you are. This is where cognitive diffusion becomes powerful. A simple shift in language can create psychological distance. Instead of saying, "I'm a failure," you say, "I am having the thought that I'm a failure." At first, that may sound like a small difference, but emotionally, it changes everything. Because the first statement fuses you with the thought. The second allows you to observe it. Don't deny it, don't suppress it. Simply notice it as a mental event, something appearing in awareness, not a final verdict. One useful metaphor is this. Imagine overthinking as wearing a virtual reality set. When the anxious simulation begins, it feels immersive, convincing, emotionally real. Your heart reacts. Your body believes the imagined threat. But cognitive diffusion is like taking off the VR headset. The scene may still exist, but now you can see it for what it is, a projection, a mental construction, not immediate reality. This shift also softens something else many overthinkers carry heavily, self-judgment. Because once you stop treating every anxious thought as truth, you no longer need to attack yourself for having them. You create space, curiosity, compassion. The internal conversation becomes less about punishment and more about observation. And for many people, that alone reduces suffering. Not because the mind becomes silent overnight, but because the thoughts lose some of their authority. Still, there is an important limitation here. Because overthinking is not purely cognitive. It does not live only in language. Sometimes, even when you intellectually understand that a thought is irrational, your body still reacts as though danger is real. Your heart races. Your muscles tighten. Your nervous system remains activated, which reveals something deeper. Thoughts live in the mind, but thoughts live in the body too. This brings us to the deepest layer of overthinking. Because at a certain point, this stops being only about thoughts. It becomes about physiology. Many people assume overthinking is simply a thinking problem, that if you could just reason more clearly, become more disciplined, or think more positively, the cycle would finally end. But that assumption misses something important. Sometimes the mind is not creating danger. Sometimes it is responding to danger the body already believes is present. This is what happens in a somatic threat state, a condition where the nervous system remains partially organized around survival, even when no immediate threat exists. The body remembers, not always in words, not always in conscious memory, but through survival physiology, a racing heart, shallow breathing, muscle tension, restlessness, hyper-alertness. And when the body enters this state, the mind begins searching for explanations. It tries to make sense of the alarm, so thoughts appear. What did I do wrong? What if something bad happens? What am I missing? The thinking feels like the problem, but often it is the symptom. The emotional truth is simple and deeply important. Your body still believes danger is here, which means logic alone may not be enough. Because you cannot reason a nervous system out of a threat state using words it does not trust. You have to communicate through sensation, through the language of the body. This is where grounding becomes powerful, not as a motivational trick, but as a biological interruption. Cold water on the face, feeling your feet against the floor, naming objects in the room, touching textured surfaces, listening carefully to nearby sounds, taking slow, deliberate breaths. These are not small distractions. They are present moment signals that tell the nervous system something critical. This moment is different. You are here, not there, now, not then. This is a sensory reset, a way of interrupting the internal simulation and bringing awareness back into physical reality. Because some minds don't need better logic, they need updated safety. And perhaps that changes how you see yourself. Because if your overthinking is partially your body trying to protect you, then the goal is not self-criticism. It is retraining, not fighting your mind, but helping your nervous system learn what safety feels like now. And once you understand that, the story becomes much less about fixing yourself and much more about learning how to care for the system that has been trying imperfectly to protect you all along. If much of what we explored today felt familiar, it may be worth pausing before reaching the conclusion many overthinkers quietly arrive at. That something is wrong with them, that their mind is defective. That piece seems easy for other people because everyone else received some internal switch they somehow missed. But perhaps the more accurate explanation is less harsh and far more human. You may not be broken. You may simply be running survival software that never got updated. Because overthinking in many cases is not random mental chaos. It is a strategy, a deeply learned attempt to create safety through anticipation, to reduce uncertainty by mentally rehearsing possibilities before they happen, to stay one step ahead of emotional pain. And if that strategy developed early enough, it can begin to feel indistinguishable from personality, like this is simply who you are. But psychological patterns are not always identity. Sometimes they are adaptation. Your overthinking is not necessarily proof of weakness. It may be proof that your mind learned vigilance because vigilance once worked, that somewhere along the way, scanning ahead helped you feel safer. Predicting outcomes helped you avoid discomfort. Rehearsing conversations helped you feel more prepared. Remaining mentally alert helped you feel less vulnerable. The problem is not that your mind learned these strategies. The problem is that many protective systems do not automatically recognize when the environment has changed, so they continue operating long after the original threat has passed. And that creates a painful paradox. The same awareness that once protected you can eventually become the thing that exhausts you. Because intelligence, sensitivity and vigilance can become heavy when they have nowhere safe to rest. Intelligence becomes suffering when awareness has nowhere safe to land. And perhaps that is the gentler truth beneath all of this. Not that you need to become less thoughtful. Not that you must force yourself into silence. Not even that your mind needs to be fixed. But that your awareness may need safety, structure, compassion, a different relationship with uncertainty. Healing in this sense is not about becoming someone who never thinks deeply. It is about becoming someone whose mind no longer believes constant vigilance is the price of peace. So before we end, I'd genuinely like you to reflect on this. When you overthink, what tends to pull you in the most? Regret about the past? Fear about the future? Imagined conversations that never happen? Or simply the discomfort of uncertainty itself? If this resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes understanding begins the moment you realize your inner patterns are more human and more shared than you once believed. Deep Ravines Lab Protocol. Characters and stories are AI-generated for motivational insights. 2. Content is curated for entertainment and exploring the messiness of human psyche. 3. No proselytizing or harmful content.